Hi guys, welcome back to my channel. For today's real-time tutorial, I'm going to be teaching you how to paint this beautiful seashell. Let's get started. Before we start, I just want to tell you guys a little bit about the supplies I'm using today. I have my Winsor & Newton Cotman pan set of paints, and this is a great travel set. It is student grade paint, so it's not the most quality paint, but I actually really love the colors, and as far as affordability goes, you really can't beat those. I'm going to be using two Lebenzen brushes today. This one's a goat hair blend. This is the small, stiff, white synthetic brush, and both of these have wonderful bamboo handles. They're 100% handmade. I absolutely love these brushes, so I can't wait to use those today. I have a water jar, and for some of the white highlights at the end, I'm going to be using my Dr. P.H. Martin's Bleed Proof White. Paper towel for blotting. Oh, and my paper is Sennelier 140-pound cold pressed paper on a block. It's actually about a 10 by 4 inch block, and I've just split it in half for the purpose of creating a smaller size for our conch shell. So let's get started. Of course, we need to do a sketch first. It's really important to start with a good sketch so that you can feel confident with your painting. So what I see is a general kind of round shape. It's almost a square, but not quite. It's sort of lopsided. So let's break it down into smaller shapes. I actually did a practice run of this earlier, and looking at my practice run here, you can see there's almost this triangular shape right here, and then we'll have the pointed pyramid-shaped tip, and then this round flaring shape. So it's actually pretty simple as far as the shapes go, but we need to decide on the size for our paper. It helps to start with marking the bottom part of your painting and the top part, just so you can get a sense of the scale. So once you have a little mark for the top and a little mark for the bottom, then you can decide the width, and where the shell kind of comes in half at this angle, it's a little wider at the top of the left side and a little narrower at the bottom of the right side. And so there you can see this triangular shape. It almost looks like a fist with knuckles coming out. So interesting. And I'm going to draw the pointed shape of the conch right here. Just a very basic shape right now. We won't worry about the details just yet. And then for the flared top coming out, I want to make sure that it's wide enough. At its widest point, it's about the same width as the center point of the bottom portion of the shell. If you're looking for ways to measure those shapes and see how tall or how wide they are, that's a good way. All right, so there we have the rough shape. Now we're going to go in and tighten everything up. I'm going to start with the tip right here, and I see in the center point of this triangle one spike coming out, a very large one, and another one mirroring it at the top, not quite as pointy. And it doesn't have to be perfect. I'm just going to create a bumpy edge here, and then a couple of these knuckle shapes coming out. This shape comes up and casts a shadow. There's a cast shadow underneath the flare of the conch. We're going to paint that in with a dark color. Little bump right here, little bump here. And if you want to do kind of these vertical lines encircling this bumpy part of the shell, that also helps us get a sense of the shape. All right, so we've almost reached the bottom of the shell. I'm going to create a stronger line with my pencil for the bottom dimension. And make sure it's not a perfect straight line. You don't see that in nature, so don't draw it that way. There's a little flare right here. And then where the two sides separate, I'm going to draw a distinct line. And you can erase any extra lines that maybe you don't want to include at this point. Not a big deal if they kind of show up under the paint. You can get more specific with the edge of this shape. There are some waves or ripples in the shell. Do include those for the sake of knowing where you're going to put your darker paint and your lighter paint. Don't worry about the highlights. We're going to be doing those last with the white. And if you don't have bleed-proof white, you can use white gouache or acrylic paint, or even something like a colored pencil or a white gel pen. There's all kinds of ways to do white in watercolor. All right, so those are the most specific bumpy shapes on the shell. Now I'm going to come back over to this side, tighten up this edge. And the top is not nearly as bumpy, so erasing any additional marks. The shadow separates from the light and it creates this almost curved shape in the center like that. So this will be the light side and the shadow side. And one last thing is just a little line here to show where the shadow on the inside of this area begins. All right, I think we're ready to start painting. This painting is going to be done largely wet and wet with the main colors, and I want you to let go of any feelings of control right now and just watch the paint do its thing. We're going to have a lot of fun with wet and wet with this one. A lot of people are scared of this technique because it does require relinquishing control, but let's give it a try today. So I'm starting with my larger brush, the goat hair brush, and I'm dipping it in the water and generously dolloping water all over the inside of my pencil marks. I'm just going to be starting with a bunch of washes, a bunch of colors that are all going to kind of merge side by side. So it's okay to just wet the entire area. Don't worry if you have any excess water right now. We can remove any excess once we've got the whole space filled in. To get the right effect for this, make sure you have cotton paper. It won't work the same with cellulose or wood-based paper. And make sure you're applying enough water so that it's fully soaking into the paper. For now, if there's a few puddles or pools, that's okay. We want to make sure it's more wet than just damp or partially dry. It's not going to work the same if it starts to dry out just too fast. But do try to stay within your lines, because remember that wherever the water goes, the paint's going to flow. I have a little bit of pooling here at the bottom as the paper is buckling or warping somewhat, and I'm actually okay with that because here at the bottom is going to be a shadow shape. It's going to be darker paint, and so if some of the paint pools there a little, that's okay. That said, I'm going to remove some of this excess water by lifting it out with the brush and swiping on the paper towel. So we do have a nice glossy wet surface. The paper is starting to warp or lift a little bit as it expands with the water, and it's ready to go. Now I'm going to dip into this brownish red color. This is burnt sienna. Grabbing a generous amount of paint, swirling my brush in it. You can see I use that color a lot. And I'm going to start with that on the bottom side of the shell, painting more carefully up to the edge of my pencil marks. And then where you see broader, bigger shapes that you want to just fill in quickly, you can use more of the belly side of the brush and just swoop it across like that. I'm going to bring that color into the center of the shell. I see this wonderful orange in my reference photo. And the more paint you apply, the brighter the color will be. So dip directly into your palette for a brilliant color. And it'll disperse a little bit on the wet paper. That's the whole goal with this wet and wet technique, is to get the paint to just blend effortlessly. Don't worry about details yet, but do apply the paint right now in areas where you see darker shapes in your reference photo. And now you might be thinking, oh, this color is all wrong. It's way too orange. Don't worry, we're going to neutralize that orange in just a minute. Anytime you have a color that's maybe a little too bright, the way to neutralize it would be to add the opposite color on the color wheel. In this case, I'm going to add ultramarine blue, wet and wet, to the color I just put down, and that's going to neutralize this tone. But for now, while my paper's still wet, I'm removing that excess paint, and I'm going to grab my alizarin crimson and drop that in while this is still nice and wet to the beautiful center of the shell right here. Pulling that color all the way across. It's a lot more vibrant in this little section of the shell, so I'm grabbing directly out of my palette, being more careful along the edge. My water didn't go quite all the way up to my pencil line, so I'm having to kind of manually encourage the paint to go up to that edge. And that's okay. And then I see a little more pink in this shadow area inside these ridges. So I'm scooping my brush along there, softening and blending, and then adding a little sliver of the color along the top. Okay, I'm going to remove that pink from my brush and dip into this brilliant turquoise blue. I'm going to be sparing with this color, but I see, ooh, that's so bright, hints of it towards the top of the shell here. And I'm going to let that color touch the pink. And of course, that's going to blend together and produce a purplish tone. I do have purple in my palette, so if you want more of a pure purple, of course, dip into your dioxazine purple or whatever purples you have in your palette. And then yellow ochre is what I'm going to use for these more yellowish tones in the light where the shell looks really, really luminous. I'm going to apply that side by side next to the alizarin crimson in these ridges. Notice I'm painting really loosely. I'm not worrying about lots of detail yet. Okay, now we have a window of opportunity while this burnt sienna is still wet to neutralize the tone wet and wet. So I'm grabbing my ultramarine blue, starting at the bottom. Since this is where I started the painting, it's starting to dry out a little bit, so I want to work quickly here. And you can see when I paint that over the top of the burnt sienna, it turns almost black. It's this nice neutral gray. But it's a different look than just painting gray, because we're getting those undertones of the burnt sienna in areas that we're missing with the blue. So it's a wonderful complex look, and I like it better than just using simple flat gray. Try to prevent any pooling or puddling if that's starting to happen. Just scoop that right back out with your brush. If you have too much water in your brush, it is going to cause backwash or blooms. Now I'm going to be a little more specific and filling in the shapes inside my pencil lines here. Need a little more water. The tip on this brush is so incredibly fine that I feel so confident filling in these little details almost effortlessly. And yet you can see we can get nice broad scooping brush strokes with the same exact brush. Now I'm grabbing my burnt sienna again and filling in this little shadow shape that we drew in with pure color. At this point the paper has dried enough that when I do that it's not going to just completely wash away, and that's good. We want it to stay put there. We wouldn't want that really dark shadow to just blur into our light areas. So as everything begins to dry, you start reaching different stages of opportunities with your painting. At this point, I can put down color, and it'll soften a little bit still, but not nearly as wildly as it did at the beginning. So I'm continuing to apply a little bit of ultramarine over the top of that burnt sienna. And while I do that, I can look at my reference photo and paint around the light areas. I'm really just filling in the shadows. Look at those wonderful colors. Okay, so I'm going to fill in my pencil all the way with this sort of light gray combination of the colors that are in my brush. And then I'm going to grab some more ultramarine, dip slightly in the water to loosen it up on my brush, and fill in the little tail end of the shell here. Taking some of that turquoise blue for an extra pop of blue on the bottom side. There was a lot of water in my brush, so I'm just kind of scooping that out to make sure that it's not going to wash out crazy for me. All right, so all of this has really begun to dry. I'm going to do a little more detail work. I'm actually going to switch to my smaller brush. Switching now to my small, stiff, white synthetic brush. I'm going to dip into my ultramarine again. I'm actually going to mix it up on my palette a little with some water. And with this ultramarine color, I'm going to start to deepen these shadows and the ridges on the top side of the conch. This is pretty much wet and dry now, as this area has completely dried. So with this color, I'm filling in any areas where the paint didn't touch at the top. And then scooping down to darken those ridges. Delicate, intentional brush strokes here. Just be aware of those bristles, where they're moving. This is such a nice, springy, easy to control brush. Something I love about it. Mixing up a little more ultramarine with some water in my palette. Use that up pretty fast. And you can see it's a more vibrant version here for this little shadow shape. To balance that out, I'm going to drop that in here and here, just so we get a nice even dispersion of that color. And now you can look over your whole shell and see if there's anything that needs some extra color balance or anything like that. I'm going to grab a little of my alizarin crimson and darken along this little edge where this shell separates in the middle. And I'm going to take that same color, dip it in the water to loosen it on my brush, and darken here at the base one more time. Rinsing slightly, and then I'm going to soften that edge with a lighter value so that it seems to just float into the lighter area effortlessly and seamlessly. And then along this ridge where the pink sort of separates into this shiny area, I'm just adding more specific light pink brush strokes. Another pop of alizarin right there and here. And I really don't see any of that pink in the shell, in the front of the shell itself. I'm going to soften that slightly. But I do see more yellow tones, so I'm going to grab my yellow ochre now. Darken along the top really quick while I have that on my brush. And then along this edge. And then I'm going to use that color to sort of outline the knuckle shapes on the shell. This is enhancing the color with pops of yellow. Keep in mind that yellow ochre is semi-transparent. It's not a fully transparent color. So be sparing with your layering with this color. This area is dry enough by now that I can work confidently with layering over the top. I'm going to take some more burnt sienna and add some streaks of that color here at the base of the shell. All right, now I don't want to risk overworking it, but there are just a couple more little details I'm going to add. Little vertical streaks that I see in the shell. Little ridges, some texture. Still working with yellow ochre here. And then these little streaks coming through that area of the shell. I'm going to add one little pop of this lemon yellow right there. And then before we let it dry and do our bleed-proof white, I'm going to add a shadow tone. I'm going to switch back to my other brush, and I'm going to take Payne's Gray and just gently paint right at the base of the shell. Nothing too crazy here. It's just the suggestion of a shadow. So that it feels grounded on our background. You might have to adjust the angle that you're holding your brush, depending on what you want to get. So there's the shadow. One little thing I'm going to correct is I don't like this little streak of red right here. So I'm going to take my wet brush or damp brush and gently scrub that, removing the paint on my paper towel, coming back and scrubbing again. And that reduced that line, and I do like that better. Okay, so we're going to let that dry completely, and then we'll come back in and do our details. All right, I'm now taking my bleed-proof white and my small detail brush, and I'm wetting the brush ahead of time to make sure that it's going to work smoothly for me. And then I'm dipping into my white, and I'm going to paint just a couple little highlights in this shiny shell. Really just following my reference photo here. Don't go overboard with these. Something you can do with the bleed-proof white is that you can water it down and create more pastel white tones to lighten certain areas. That's something I'm going to do over here to lighten that section. But for now I'm painting with just the pure white, adding these really nice pops and highlights to the shell. All right, so with a little more water in my brush and the white, I'm going to paint a less brilliantly white highlight along the bottom of the shell here. Some of that got lost in my painting, so we're just restoring the light back into that area without it being too bright and overpowering. Looks nice and shiny now. And then I'm going to add a little vertical stripe right next to that shadow shape that we painted, showing these striations or textures in the shell. And then one little curved shape here. Very subtle, it's hard to see. All these little details really do help. And then if you want to restore any of the highlights on these knuckles, I don't know what they're actually called, but on the bumps of the shell, I think those can look pretty cool. If it gets too bright, you can always water it down. There's our finished conch shell. I hope you guys enjoyed this seashell tutorial. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.